Hey, truth seekers. Have you ever been given information that was just too much, too soon? Maybe it was something important, but you weren't ready for it yet. Spiritual growth is much like that. It's a process, a developmental journey. Today we're going to explore how wisdom and discernment are crucial in knowing when and how to share truth. We'll look at biblical principles that guide us on how to reveal deeper knowledge at the right time, in the right way, to the right people. From the teachings of Yeshua to the wisdom of Proverbs, we'll discover how these ancient lessons still hold the key to sharing truths without overwhelming or causing harm. Now, I want to mention that this channel is for deep divers. This channel really isn't designed for the novice. I'm sure, and I would hope that they would get something out of it, but this channel really is designed for people that have been on the road a little while. And so keep that in mind when sharing this channel, or depending on what content you share, because we wouldn't want to trip anyone up for sure. That's the opposite of what I want to do with this channel. Some of you, hopefully many of you, are aware that Paul talked on the subject of milk and meat. And he wasn't giving us a lesson on kosher when he was talking about that. He's talking on a spiritual level. And that's something that I try to do with a lot of these videos, is show the different levels and show how the natural or physicality points to the unseen realm or the spiritual realm. And so in the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 3, as well as Hebrews chapter 5, Paul explains how he fed the Corinthians with milk and not solid food because they weren't really able to bear it. They weren't ready for it. And in Hebrews, it's noted that they still needed milk, not solid food, because they were not mature enough to swallow it or digest those deeper truths that they should have already been ready for and mature enough to where they could take that, but unfortunately they were not. And so he knew that jumping ahead too quickly could cause more harm than good. And this is a real problem, I feel like, nowadays, specifically in the Hebrew roots and Messianic movements. I feel like many people, I would almost say most, that I have observed, lack the wisdom and discernment on properly dispensing information at the right time to the right individuals. And when we're talking about like a video like this, or when you're talking to an audience, it's a little bit different thing, because you've got a mixture of different types of people at different levels. And I believe there are built-in defense mechanisms naturally to protect people that aren't ready for certain truths or certain types of wisdom, that they're just not at a place where they're going to be able to receive it, that it would be a stumbling block to them. And so I think that there are built-in defense mechanisms that protect people from a lot of things, but I think it's important to be able to read the room as well. And so I try to do that when I'm speaking to a group of people. I try to determine at what level that group is at, and I try to tailor my speech and my terminology toward that group, so that hopefully that we can be on the same page, and where my communication is effective with them. So like Paul talks about that he's learned to be all things to all men. I try to do that as well. I try to, depending upon the person or group that I'm visiting with or sharing with, I try to adjust my speech to maximize on the understanding of that individual or group, rather than expect them to automatically understand a bunch of concepts and terminology that I know that they have not been exposed to yet. And so that wouldn't be helpful for anybody. And so I think it's important that we look at our motives and our intentions. And a lot of times I've seen people that they're just I'm tempted to use a word to describe that could cause offense, but their verbal expression is just basically stimulating their own selves, not really their motive and their intention is not to help others to grow. Okay, it's just self-stimulation. Hopefully you get the hint there. In the book of Romans chapter 7 verse 14, Paul says that the law or the Torah is spiritual, but we are carnal. And this is a subject matter that I don't think a lot of people in the Messianic or Hebrew roots movement or anyone else much understands. The difference between physicality and spiritual. And very few of them realize that the Torah is in all actuality spiritual. They are carnally minded, and so that's the only way they can interpret anything is through that lens of carnality or materialism. And so we have to be able to understand the difference between form and force, or form and essence. You know, I'm reminded of the verse, I believe it's in Timothy, where Paul talks about they have a form of godliness, but they deny the power thereof. So, stated another way, they have a form of godliness, but deny the essence thereof, or the spiritual or the non-physicality aspect they're oblivious to. And there's a verse in 1 Corinthians chapter 15:46 that I referenced quite a bit. Did a video on not too long ago. You might want to check out. I think it was called The Mystery of the Firstborn or something like that. I would highly encourage you to check that one out. But it says, it's not the thing that is spiritual that is first, but the natural. In this space-time material realm, what appears first is the natural or physical thing, then the spiritual comes later and is revealed. And so in that video and in others, I've talked about this, that we see whether we're talking about Cain and Abel, Ishmael and Isaac, Esau and Jacob, Reuben and Joseph, Manasseh and Ephraim, that we have this natural or material or egoic type or example, then followed by the spiritual son. And so it's that way with concepts as well. So we have, like, when we're talking about the covenant that was made at Har Sinai, Mount Sinai, that we're talking about words that were engraved upon stones, in contrast to the new covenant or the renewed covenant, the Brit Hadashah, that is engraved within human hearts. And there's a number of these verses that are important to contemplate and study and think about, I believe, to begin to understand some of these deeper concepts, because I think a person has to be where they're at. And so we have to start out with milk, but there's a certain point in your journey or in your walk, you should be maturing and be able to begin to chew and swallow and digest, stronger meats or more complex truths or mysteries. And so that's a lot of what I focus upon with this channel. In the book of Deuteronomy or Devarim, chapter 25, verse 4, it says that you're not to muzzle the mouth of the ox that treads out the corn. And so a lot of people read that verse, and if you don't own any oxen, you probably figure that verse is irrelevant for you and doesn't apply, and you can just move on to another subject matter that might be more pertinent or relevant to you in particular. But again, the law is spiritual, as Paul said. And he says the letter kills, but the spirit gives life. Muzzling the mouth of the ox is not just about that ox. The spiritual Torah is housed within that physical Torah. It's the clothing that the outer garments that clothe the essence or the body, the real, the authentic thing. And so Paul, who studied at the feet of Gamaliel, the grandson of the great Torah teacher Hillel, and Gamaliel is still considered a great rabbi as well, he understood that the scriptures were not just written on one level, on a two-dimensional level, that these things are as the Torah, the scriptures are as deep as the ocean, and there's these different levels and understandings and lenses that we can look at it through. And so in the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 9, for example, and there's also another place, and I'm trying to remember where that's at. It might be in Timothy. He quotes this verse, and he says that he asked in one place, he said, is this verse, does God care for the oxen, or was it written for our benefit? Let me state that another way. He's basically saying, essentially, asking a rhetorical question, was this commandment about not muzzle the mouth of the ox, was it given because God is so concerned for the oxen, which certainly God does care about his creatures, but no, that's not the ultimate purpose. He says, or for our benefits was it written. And he goes on to say, yes, no doubt it's for our benefit that this commandment is given, that he that ploweth should be able to plow in hope. In another place, he compares the ox that treads out the corn to elders and those that labor in the word. That's kind of a whole teaching in and of itself, but the ox there is not just talking about a physical ox, that you shouldn't prevent that physical ox from eating, that is doing the work of trading out the grain or the corn, but that it is a bigger spiritual principle that encompasses a lot of different situations. And so I hope that this will make sense as we go forward, because there's a lot of the writings of the New Testament writings, or the apostolic writings that some call them, the New Testament. We have various writers referring to passages in the Tanakh, or what's often referred to as the Old Testament, giving us a deeper level of understanding about it. And so the point of it all is to don't restrict the nourishment or reward that is appropriate to the labor someone is doing. And also, to keep in mind what they're equipped for. And so, like, if whether we're talking about on a natural realm, if someone is purchased all the food or is cooking all the food, they ought to be able to eat some of it, right? That would be only fair. And likewise, if people are laboring and breaking up new ground in the scriptures, and they're like an ox treading this stuff down, they ought to be able to in some way benefit from all of the work that they are doing. And so Paul uses that principle to describe that. And so we want to be careful not to overwhelm people that aren't ready to handle certain truths. And there is this arrogance and an attitude and a cruelty, I would even say at times, that I have witnessed in the Hebraic roots Messianic movement, and people just say, well, if they can't handle the truth, that's just their problem. That's not a godly approach nor a scriptural approach. That is a very egocentric, self-centered, destructive, or even cruel approach. That is not the way it's supposed to be done, and I hope that will become more clear as we go through more of this. So we saw in that example that the ox represents a certain type of person. Likewise, Yeshua said, don't cast your pearls before swine, or the thing which is holy before dogs. And so he spoke parabolically like this all the time. And so I think it's obvious, or clear, should be, that when he's talking about not to cast your pearls before swine, he is talking about the pearls symbolize valuable truths or wisdom that you have to be cautious about who you share those things with and when and how. And likewise the dogs, because it's different types of people that are not kosher. They do not have the this past week we read the Torah portion Shemini in the book of Leviticus or Vayikra, and in chapter 11 it gives the qualifications of what types of animals can be eaten, the land animals and the land animals in the water, and the creeping things and the birds and all of that. And it gives us a strict criteria for how we can determine what is clean and unclean. And if you're interested, I would recommend, we have a video called, I'm trying to remember what it's called, something about what is the real reason for kosher. And we go into that a little bit and talk about how by looking at the natural we can understand the spiritual, and that each of those animals on one level of understanding represents various types of people. So these animals are archetypes that give us insight into different types of people. Just earlier today, my wife and I were returning home after eating in a restaurant, and the subject of this person that we both know came up, and I said, you know, I don't know why, but I've never trusted the guy. There's something about him. He reminds me, I get a feeling of a snake or this snapping turtle, right? You know, right under the surface of the waters. That's just sort of a little bit slimy and conniving, and for some reason I don't trust him. And when I think about him, I often think about some type of reptile, and because I think that, you know, he's operating in a similar type of energy as that of an unclean reptile of some kind. And so the Bible gives us a lot of examples of different types of people like that. Of I send you out as sheep among wolves, and Yeshua talks about, you know, den of vipers. And again, that fox Herod, he's talking about different types of people. And by the way, another video you might want to check out that we have goes into talking about the language of parables and some of these deeper levels of understanding. And I think it might be the one that's called, Is the Bible a Mystical Book? Or something like that, I think is one of them that goes into that topic a little bit. And so we have to be careful about what we say to whom at what time and what context, and not just because certain people are not ready to hear them because of the maturity level, but because of what they might do with these holy truths. They, like a pig or a dog, has very little discernment in how to treat something holy. Anything they touch, they're going to treat as common or profane. They're going to profane those things. And so you have to keep that in mind when you're talking to people, and have the discernment to know, I'm not saying judge them in a way of lifting yourself up or putting other people down, in that kind of thing, but we are to have discernment and realize what type of animal you're talking to. Are you talking to a person that is kosher, a clean person, or are you talking to someone who is not, who doesn't have those qualifications, or are you talking to someone who is just immature? And so that type of discernment has to be practiced and developed, which brings us to the next verse I'd like to talk about. In the book of Exodus chapter 23, also in Deuteronomy 14, it says, don't cook a kid in its mother's milk, or don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. And so now this was on a physical level, an actual Canaanite practice that pagans would do. And so it would be a rather cruel and wicked thing to do. But again, the law, the Torah, is spiritual. And so let me just real quickly say that this is where in Judaism they base the idea that you should not mix meat and dairy products together. And I'm not saying that interpretation is right or wrong. I can understand, and I don't, at this point, subscribe to it. In other words, I still will eat a cheeseburger. I may not always, because I want to leave open that option for if I gain greater understanding and determine that's something that I shouldn't do, I want to leave myself room to adjust. And I certainly can understand how they got there conceptually. Because, again, just as we saw with muzzling the mouth of the ox, a kid is like an immature or new believer, okay? And so, again, as we saw, the milk basically is conceptually related to those fundamental or elementary truths or principles, foundations that a new believer should be, you should be given to a new believer to nourish them. And so what kind of a cruel thing would it be to boil a kid alive in its mother's milk? And so, and a lot of people would think, okay, well, I would never do that. I would never heat up milk and boil some, baby goat in that milk. But a lot of people do things much worse by how they communicate and how they relate to new believers or those who are still on milk. There are people, and so you're going to need to be able to discern, are you dealing with a kid or are you dealing with someone who's more mature? And so that milk should be nurturing that immature kid, but instead, in that scenario, they're being boiled alive in it. How many times have you seen a situation where you have someone who has some knowledge, or at least has some pieces of information, and they're talking to someone who is a novice, a new believer, or someone who just doesn't really have the depth, or they're not able to really sustain or chew on a lot of strong meat yet. And rather than give them milk and help nourish them along in their walk and help them develop and exhort them and build them up, they boil them alive in their knowledge. And so this is a lot of people would never, if I ask for a show of hands, how many of you have ever gone out and found a baby goat and heated up milk and threw that thing in it and boiled it alive? No one would admit to that. I mean, I'm sure none of you have probably done that. I would certainly hope not. But how many of you have done that on a spiritual level? How many of you have come in contact with someone who doesn't know near as much as you do, and rather than help them along, you boil them alive in their mother's milk? I'm reminded of an example. Some years ago, there was this young guy who came by my house, and he was looking for to do some yard work or anything he could for some money. And so I hired him to mow my grass and do some work around my house and stuff like that. And he and I got to talking and visiting and had a real good rapport. And he was, I think he had been to prison, it seems like. And we talked, and he had a drug problem, and he was trying to get straightened out, and was very receptive to the things I was speaking to him about. And, I'm just trying to understand where he's at, and I'm trying to help him get to the next step that he needs to get to begin to climb out of this dark hole that he's in. And so I went inside, or later that evening or something, there was someone who was over, and I mentioned, or they might have shown up at the time or something. They said, "Who's that guy?" And so I began to explain, and the person said, "Well, did you talk to him about the Sabbath?" And I said, "No. Right now, I'm just trying to help the guy get off of meth, okay? We'll worry about that way down the road." And so a lot of times that seems real obvious to me, and it should seem obvious to you, but that would be boiling a kid in its mother's milk. This boy had real problems, and he was an immature kid. He's the ox that's fallen in the ditch, and you could come up with many different analogies and examples that exemplify that. But it would be not only wrong, but would be cruel for me to begin to throw a bunch of stuff on him like that. And so that's what in the book of Acts, chapter 15, the Jerusalem Council, they were looking at, well, how do we deal? Because up until that point, the assembly, the kahal, the church, was basically Jewish. It was people with a Jewish background that understood and observed the Sabbath, the Shabbat, and the festivals, and kept kosher and all of that. And they went to synagogue on the Sabbath and on the different festivals, and they understood. This was their background that they were raised in. But now there's a lot of Gentiles going in that are coming in, becoming part of the assembly, the church. They're being grafted in, right? Romans chapter 11, which is great. And they were all, for example, in chapter 21 of Acts, they were all really happy about this and were rejoicing with all of these Gentiles coming in. But they were having some issues that they had to figure out the best way to mitigate or ameliorate. And so they decided, hey, let's just tell them these 4 basic things: to stop fornicating, which is something that's not talked about very much anymore, and to avoid fornication, sexual immorality. That's something that is not a very popular message these days. Even among Messianics and Hebrew roots, there's a lot of this going on that nobody wants to talk about, the elephant in the room, in a lot of cases with these subjects. That was one of the things. So avoid sexual immorality or fornication, and things sacrificed into idols. A little bit later in the chapter, it clarifies, and it's meaning specifically eating things sacrificed into idols, and eating things strangled, or eating blood. And so it's worth noting there that 3 out of 4 things that are mentioned there that the new believers were to be told about had to do with eating. And so that's I think that realization would be a shock to a lot of people, that 3 of the 4 initial commandments that the Gentiles were given, that were being grafted in, becoming part of the kahal, the ecclesia, the church, had to do with eating. And so, and where did they come up with these ideas in the first place? Well, from the Torah, because they were still operating and continue to operate with a Torah-based paradigm. But they're seeing the Torah on a deeper level now. They're seeing the Torah through the lens of the Spirit. The Spirit is illuminating these things too, and so they're able to see beyond just the physicality or the forms to the essence. They're able to see beyond just mere letter to the spirit of these commandments. And so I've given you just a few here to talk about. Here's another one here we should look at. In the Torah, Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 8, it says that when you build a house, be sure and put a fence around your roof. And so, like, to put this in context, in those days, they had flat roofs, and it was the custom that in like the evenings, in the cool of the evening, a lot of times they would get up on their roof and they would have like a little patio area up there that they would relax and visit and even entertain guests on the roof. And but there's a commandment, Deuteronomy 22:8, that I've mentioned, that when you build a house, make sure that you build a fence or a railing around the top of your roof, because if you don't and somebody were to fall off of your roof, it says you'll bring blood guilt upon your house. And so again, this goes back to the idea that you are your neighbor's keeper, and that when we begin to look at the let's take it back. Let's just look at the physical basic level of this right now. So let's say we go back in time, we get into the DeLorean, and we're let's say I've got a new house I built, and I haven't yet had time to put a fence up around the edge of the roof, and I've invited a lot of people over, and we're sort of inaugurating the house and having a celebration or whatever, and who do you think would be most vulnerable to potentially falling off the edge of the roof? Well, how about a blind person? Definitely. A blind person would be definitely vulnerable to falling off the edge of the roof, right? What about a lame person? Yes. Somebody in a wheelchair or someone on crutches or that doesn't have good ambulatory skills would be in greater danger of falling off of the roof. What about children? Yep. Toddlers, little kids would be in greater danger of getting hurt, falling off the edge of that roof, or the elderly. And so we can think of several different people that would be more vulnerable, or anyone could. Maybe somebody had a few too many beers or whatever and fell off the edge. If you haven't made the appropriate safeguards and put up a fence on your roof, then you bring blood guilt. Their blood is on your head. You know, even if it was maybe partly their fault or whatever, or they weren't paying attention, they were just too immature, or they were blind, or they stumbled, whatever, you bear some amount of culpability in that person falling. So taking this to the next level, the level of spirituality, and for example, this channel, we get into some lofty concepts on this channel on a regular basis. We ascend beyond the normal places that people discuss many times, and which is fine. You know, that's fine to do. Or if you're having you've got a study group, or you're having a service or whatever, and you want to get in some lofty, higher thought concepts, that's fine. But be cautious and be sure to put a fence around things before you get started. And so I try to do that because I realize that there's things that I say sometimes that I need to put a fence around it, because someone who is immature, who doesn't have the stability, the background, could run with something, could fall off the edge and hurt themselves on a spiritual level, or even worse. Who knows? So what started out or was intended to be a good thing could be a very fatal or destructive thing if it is not governed properly. And so if you're building something, teaching or guiding people, you're revealing truths, more lofty truths, you've got to put safeguards in. You know, now once I put the safeguards up, and I put a fence around the roof, and I put signs up, and I've made disclaimers, and I've tried to be, I've done everything within my power. Then if somebody wants to jump off the edge, I've done everything I can. If they are intent on falling or doing something foolish that's self-sabotaging or harming to themselves, I can't do that. But I want to make sure that I do everything within my power to where I put proper safeguards in place from my end, to where hopefully that does not happen. And we have to anticipate that others might be vulnerable and might fall if exposed to things that they're not ready for. Okay? Yeshua taught in parables, as we see in Matthew chapter 13 for one place. And in fact, it says he taught in parables, and without a parable he did not speak. And it says when he was asked, why do you speak in parables? He said, because It's given unto you to know the mysteries of the kingdom, and those that are without, it's not given, so that seeing they don't see, and hearing they do not understand. And so, like, parables have by their nature, are a way to both simultaneously conceal and reveal at the same time. And so they're a helpful way to where, in this case, Yeshua could deliver information and it would be veiled or sealed to those that were not yet mature, or where their hearts were not yet prepared to receive that truth. And so this is something I think that we really need to take seriously and be more cautious and careful in the way we deliver truth. And I hope that you folks will, if you know others, and I know this is a big problem out there, and so if you think other people will benefit from this, please share it and pass along this information. So truth is sometimes hidden to protect, not to harm. And again, we need to overcome this fallacy that just because something is true that you should say it and shout it from the rooftops. That is not necessarily true, as we're going to see as we move forward. All right. So in the book of Proverbs, there's lots of warnings about speech. There's a whole lot in that book, and I like to read Proverbs every relatively often to again try to absorb the wisdom of that book and remind myself of a lot of these very important principles. In the book of Proverbs 25 verse 11, it says, "A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in a setting of silver." And when you've witnessed this, whether you've been part of it on whichever end of the speaker or listener, or you're observing the situation, you know and you feel the truth of that when that happens. Because sometimes, every once in a while, somebody says what needs to be said at the right time in just the right way. And so it's a beautiful thing when truth is shared at the right time, to the right people, and in the right way. But on the other hand, in Proverbs chapter 12 verse 18, it says, "There is one whose rash words are like a sword that thrusts through, but the tongue of the wise brings healing." And so truth can bring wounds, or it can bring healing. And we don't want to destroy with the truth, or we certainly don't want to destroy standing grain or that which is good. If you do that, you're going to be held accountable for it. You can console or comfort yourself and say, "Well, I'm just telling the truth and I'm just telling it like it is." You're going to answer for that. You're going to answer if you're not being responsible with the truth you have, and you are using it to destroy people rather than use that to build and exhort and encourage. If you're just using it to hurt people or destroy people, you're going to have some serious things to answer for. So timing and readiness matter, even with the truth. Misused truth can wound. It's important to speak truth at the right time to the right audience. In the book of Ecclesiastes, it lays this out beautifully. In Ecclesiastes chapter 3, it says, "To everything there is a season and a time, to every purpose under heaven. A time to keep silent, a time to speak," and so on. Time for war, time for peace, time to embrace, time to cease from embracing, and all that. So it's essential that we grasp and we realize that, to be discerners of the times, that just because something is true or something is good, there is a right time and a wrong time. And so any of these things, like a good thing, is a bad thing if it's not done at the right time. Okay, just because something is true or good, if it is not delivered with wisdom and discernment, it can be destructive. And again, people will answer for that. So timing is essential, even in good things. Like speaking the truth, it can become destructive if done at the wrong time. Discernment is needed to recognize the right moment to speak or remain silent. And a lot of times it's that. Just because someone says something that's wrong even does not mean that you should counter it or refute it. Sometimes you should, probably a lot of times. I mean, it depends on what it is, and again, the time. There's a lot of things that I hear people say that are erroneous or off kilter in some way or another, yet I may not address it, or I may not address it at that time. Again, there's a time and season for everything under the sun, and so you have to discern. You have to weigh those things out and see, would it be better to deal with that later on, or give them an opportunity maybe to where they can see the truth. It may not take us saying anything or doing anything. The Holy Spirit, the Ruach HaKodesh, who guides in all truth, may reveal that to them a little bit further down the road. You have to recognize, are you dealing with a kid in its mother's milk? You don't want to boil the kid in its mother's milk. If you're dealing with someone who's able to bear and consume strong meat, okay, it might be appropriate, or maybe not. You'll just have to determine that. But I think one of the best things is to learn to be patient and to learn to pause before just pouring all of this stuff out that or you think on people. You have to look at them and the situation as vessels. Are they able to bear it at that time? And then decide how much. And just because they ask a question doesn't mean you should. Proverbs again says a fool utters everything he knows. And so you have to sort of, you have to vacillate between flow and limitation. There's a time to let truth flow out to a point, but we still have to put a limit on it. And we don't want to overload someone's donkey. We don't want to give them more than they're able to bear at that time. So incrementalism, give them what they need, give them the milk or even the meat if they need that, but don't give them so much that they choke on it or that they're flooded by all of the information. The sons of Issachar that we read about in 1 Chronicles chapter 12 verse 32 are a great example, because it says that of the sons of Issachar who had understanding of the times to know what Israel ought to do. So I think a lot of times this is interpreted through the eschatological or prophetic lens, and it certainly could be. But I think that a lot of things, this is just good, pragmatic, practical horse sense of this group of people understood the principles of Ecclesiastes 3 of knowing, is it a time for doing A or a time for doing B? Is it a time to speak? Is it a time to remain silent? Is it a time for flow? Is it a time for limitation? And so in this example, it would be good for us to strive to imitate the sons of Issachar who had understanding or binah, discernment of the times and seasons, to recognize what Israel ought to do and what should be said and done at a specific time. So true wisdom is time sensitive. It's not mechanical. It's about knowing when and what action to take based on understanding the times and conditions. Let me give you one more here. Yeshua rebuked the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 16 verse 3 because he said, you hypocrites, you can discern the face of the sky. You can if you look at the sky and it's red, you know that's portends negative weather, right? Bad forecast. And he said that how is it that you see these natural signs and you can't understand the signs of the times? And so once again, Yeshua is berating, rebuking, correcting, trying to religious people here, people that shouldn't be kids or immature. They should be more mature, but they're hypocritical. They are filled with cognitive dissonance. They're double-minded. They are, it's the Dunning-Kruger effect. They are fixated on the natural or physicality, the material, and oblivious to the spiritual. They are incapable, at least at that time, of looking at the natural and seeing the spiritual. So they're unable to interpret the signs of the times of what's appropriate for the time that they're in. And so we want to be careful, and this is something that I believe I certainly do, we all need to practice on, most people that I know. So I hope that today's exploration gave you a deeper understanding of the importance of timing, wisdom, and discernment in sharing truths with others. Just as Scripture guides us in how to nurture spiritual growth, we too must recognize when someone is ready to digest the deeper lessons of life or not. If you found value in this video, please give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe so that you never miss out on future insights. And if you know someone who might benefit from this, share it with them. Remember, truth can be like a seed. Plant it at the right time, and it will grow. Until next time, stay wise, stay discerning. God bless you.
Hey, if you like this video, please click like and subscribe to be notified whenever we release new content, and to help other people find us out there on the vast plains of YouTube land. If you have a question or a topic you'd like for us to do a video about, just leave it in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching. Later, y'all.